Welcome to the third and final segment in the Innovation Series, Dynamic Leadership Innovation Series. Today's topic is change management, although the practice is actually much more like change leadership, and probably more so today than it has ever been, at least in the US. Today I'm zooming out to look at the larger landscape, one that helps us understand why the future will not look like the past. In the first segment, I mentioned Ray Dalio's Changing World Order. An interesting thing occurs when I bring this up in conversations. In the US, the reaction tends to be one that I would expect from fans of a sports team. It's understandable. They give reasons for why China cannot replace the US in the world order. And that's understandable, as I said. However, that's not my point. The point in bringing it up, Ray Dalio's Changing World Order outlines cycles that nations go through, whether from a global view or internally. China went through centuries of dynasty changes following the same pattern. Cycles that nations go through, rising, peaking, and eventually declining. While it's easy to argue between two countries, one country replacing the other, I'd like to isolate it and just take a look at what it means for the United States. So that way we don't get caught up in the positive mental attitude, that kind of response. I have the cover of the book here. And if you look at this graph, this would be the macro cycle. And this cycle is, think of it almost like a generation. So the current world order has the US at the top, and it's basically from 1945. And he talks about it in 5 stages, and we're somewhere in here, the 5 stages, which I'll cover in a moment. And what I want to point out about this is if you just look at the US and you look at these mini cycles or the micro cycles in the context of the larger cycle, you can see this is what we've been living through. You know, you hang in there and it reverses. You hang in there, it reverses. And if you look at it from another lens, this is almost like an oscillator where it indicates when a trend shift is going to change. But if you know anything about oscillators, they can stay in that signal zone for much, much longer than you would ever expect. But something else is also true. When the microcycle trend coincides with the macrocycle trend, you can see an acceleration. And this is what I am talking about here. Now, this is not fear and all. I don't want to get into fear mongering. It's not about that. It's about looking at the world through the lens of what Jim Collins calls the Stockdale paradox. The Stockdale paradox is recognizing that facing the brutal facts that we've got some challenges ahead of us, but at the same time, knowing that we will prevail. That's that balance. It's different than just, oh, everything's going to be fine, rose-colored glasses. And it goes back to what I mentioned in an earlier talk where I said that when I used a graph and I said when we are looking at time, compared to a gap to reality, that in the near term, our plans, designs, transformations, innovations, whatever, they need to be grounded in reality. You know, the whole positive mental attitude and a lot of my other talks, the positive mental attitude and this manifestation and visualization and success principles like that, I talk about collapsing the woo-woo gap because you can't have agency if you're expecting the solution to come from out there in the universe, for example. Yes, serendipity happens. Yes, we do get some good luck here and there. And when you're working hard, you tend to get more good luck. But it's not like your working hard makes that happen. It's that internally, we start to see things that we would not have seen had we not been working hard. Now, we can argue that and debate that, but what I'm suggesting is to have agency and personal leadership, having a view that you are in control of your destiny from that perspective is healthier than thinking that you have to do some things, have a lot of belief, and then hopefully some knight in shining armor will come along. As we get further out into the future, we're able to think in terms of the infinite possibilities. So in looking at that point through the lens of where we are here, if Ray is correct and we're in stage 5 or late stage 4 and we're somewhere in here, this decline can be very rapid, and I would suggest that we are inside that. We need to be grounded in reality, taking a look at what's really going on. That's just my point of view. I think everybody will look at this and come up with their own point of view, and that's why I'll be starting with the real world conversations about innovation and leadership starting next week, just to where we're getting grounded into reality, what's really happening. So this here is where I'm focusing on right now when we talk about change leadership. And the point is that if you had to pick one and say, is VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, going to increase over the next 2 to 3 years, or will it decrease? I think you'd have to agree that it's going to increase. If you think it's going to decrease, then maybe this is a different conversation. But that's where I'm coming from in terms of where we need to be thinking about when it comes to innovation. Something that is interesting to me is that when I look at things like people agree that 95% of people's actions are by habit. But yet, when we look at change management or change leadership, we tend to approach it from a communication standpoint. Well, if we tell them, and we tell them more often, which is helpful, right? But we lose sight of the fact that left to their own devices, people will do what they've done in the past. Under stress, even more so. And while in a stress reaction, in a survival reaction, it's almost 100% of what they've done in the past. So if we're expecting them to behave differently into the future, telling them is not enough. We have to lead by example. We have to take steps so that they actually change. And if you think about a change curve going like that, there are things you'll do in the beginning. We talk about early adopters. In Tipping Point, use the title Mavens. These are the people who can be like influencers. And that was written before the social media influencers. They also talk about the connectors. So you're going to leverage that. From a build standpoint, I say that you start in the build. While you're building, and we talk about iterative build, while you're building, this is when you want to start introducing it to some of your early adopters so you get them talking. You create the connectors, you create the mavens, you correct the salespeople by putting it out there and letting them see it. And then you get some other things coming in with social proof. And in here is where you have that social proof is going to help. And then up here is you have the momentum. So somewhere along in here, you're going to have critical mass. And while it's not a scientific term in the context of change management, the general thinking has been somewhere around 30 to 40%. When 30 to 40% of the people agree, then this line can get steep and you can take off. The nursing comes in getting to that point and being aware that that's a process and it's not going to happen with just communication. So this is why I say change leadership is a better term than change management, because you're having to pull them along, you're having to lead by example. Another challenge that comes here is that when people are facing the unknown, there's a higher correlation to fear. That's because you're going back to the hunter-gatherer, right? The unknown presented risks. You don't know what's there. You come out to an open field or you go over a ridge, you don't know what's there. So there's going to be more fear because it's not familiar. So the unfamiliar creates anxiety. Anxiety creates more stress. The challenge is that if we are transforming means we have to go into the unknown. And this is an important point because, I like to say the same hammer that forges steel can shatter glass. And depending on how people respond to risks and danger, and that has an impact on how they respond to the change that's coming. So we have to make sure that we're aware of who's going to need some extra support in going through that process. So transformation, by definition, means we're going to go into the unknown. Transformation means designing into the field of infinite possibility. And if you're in the field of infinite possibility, again, by definition, you're talking about a lot of unknown. There's a lot of risks out there. And this is why gaps and problems, while they seem similar, so if you're talking about project management, you clearly identify the problem. That applies to clearly define the gap too, right? But I think the similarities do end. For example, if we say that down here is the problem zone, right? To get where we're in the problem zone, we want to get back up here to status quo. And up here is the gap. Well, if you just look at it in simple terms, if we have a problem, it's because for some reason we dropped below that status quo line, and now we've got to correct it. And we've seen this in organizations. The metrics don't line up, something's showing up that there's a problem. It's all hands on deck, we're going to solve this. On the other hand, the gap is something we have to design, but we don't have tapes or hooks to hang this stuff on. This creates or can create some insecurity. There's less confirmation. You're designing into this unknown zone, and it creates anxiety, it creates stress. There's I call it cognitive dissonance. In order to cross this gap, we're going to have some cognitive dissonance going on because we're doing something and we don't have the security blanket, whatever that is for you. Now, some people thrive on this. This is where they live. We talked about space designers, space fillers, and space users. Space designers are going to be more comfortable in here. Space users, all things being equal, would probably be less comfortable in there. So again, when we're innovating, we may be solving a problem, but we're solving the problem with a solution that's out into the field of infinite possibilities. And that gap is between where we are, you are here, and where we're going. The vision, the goal, or what have you. And whatever that is on the other side is going to be worth it. But going through here could be difficult. It could be starts and stops and lots of challenges. And this is why sometimes innovation projects are so difficult, because fear is constantly present because we're seeing the unknown, and the unknown can lead to fear. And then when you tap this into the habits, there's another thing that's going on. Assignments and promotions generally follow a pattern of skill match to the organization needs. So then if that's true, then those skills matched where we were before. They may not match where we're going or what we need to do. That's not a big problem. The problem is if we don't recognize it. Recognizing it and then assigning people into the right roles, giving them the support that they need. This is why I think some organizations like to hire consultants. People will say, well, consultants just come and ask us questions, and then they put the answers on the slides. But the other thing that consultants are doing is they have a fresh look. They don't have the baggage. They don't have the fear of the change. They're not living with how we've always done it, and that they can see through the nuance. So I would not discount the value of having consultants come in and do that work, even though it feels like you could have said the same thing, but could you have done the same thing? If you agree that 95% of what we do is done by habit, it raises the question. The biggest obstacle to change is habit itself. That's why they say culture eats strategy for lunch. Just think about those factors when you're in the context of change management. And that's why I talk about change leadership versus change management. And then the last point is that we have to have an identity shift. What I mean by that is this is sort of a be, do, have. We have to become, when you're doing individual work, and if you're playing sports, or you have to become that team that can win before you can go out and win a championship. You have to become that first. You're not going to go out and win the championships without doing the inner work. That's true for people too. It's true for organizations. We have to do the inner work and get the alignment. We have to get people working internally. And that's that identity shift. Identity works well when you're thinking about a person, but it's an organizational shift. It's a cultural shift that happens internally so that you can face what's outside. To look at that, I took this piece from Ray Dalio. By the way, the stages, the 5 stages, rise and early growth is happening in the beginning. And then we have the expansion and the buildup. The peak and maturity is in here. So we've lived that. And I know I hear millennials say the baby boomers did it, right? The baby boomers' fault. Well, we were riding this cycle. This cycle started at the end of World War II, and that's the cycle that was going on. And it's probably the buildup and expansion is why so many people were born, which led to the baby boomers. So that's not all wrong. But if you just dismiss it as the baby boomers did it, we lose sight of this cycle, which I think is important. So we have the peak and the maturity, and then we have the early decline, and this would be the beginning of stage 4, and then we have the late stage 4. And this line makes it look very steep. Some of his curves are very shallow, more like a traditional bell curve. Again, we don't know, but I will tell you that when the short-term trends and the long-term trends coincide, it's almost like climate and weather. You can almost look at it like that. And then we have the late decline, which is in here. And again, we're somewhere in late stage 4 or early stage 5. And then we have the crisis period, which is here. Organizations go through the same kind of cycle, but their crisis, they tend to restructure. They tend to go into bankruptcy. They reorganize. They get sold, whatever. They do something different to get through this crisis. But internally, as the organization, they went through a crisis. The way Ray talks about countries, this crisis could look scary. But I would argue that it's out in the field of infinite possibilities, and we can design our way out of that. So to put it in a little bit better perspective, I'm going to just take a look at, he uses he calls it 5 wars that the countries are going through. But if you look at it from an individual standpoint, because life is very fractal, right? Our internal environment is the external environment of ourselves. The organization's internal environment is the external environment of people. So if it's toxic inside the organization, you're going to have problems. You're going to have people not happy. You're going to have people getting sick. You're going to have infighting going on that doesn't need to. The internal environment of the country is the external environment of the organization. So again, the more drama you have and chaos you have, that's going to infect the organizations. And again, the point being that it's very fractal. So what I did was, rather than look at organizations, because it's so different, we can look at it having to do with people. So by breaking it down, he talks about there being 5 different wars. The technology war, and just think about AI. I was heavily involved in rolling out technology, et cetera, during the dot-com era, and seeing that change going from AS400s to PCs, and then going from into the using portals. That transition was huge for the organizations, but it wasn't scary. When you look at what AI is doing, people are not certain. People are unsure. They're seeing robots. They're seeing jobs go away. We don't know sometimes what we're looking at. If you spend any time on social media, you know how many deep fakes there are that are very, very compelling in terms of their believability. I would say we are years ahead of where we thought we would be from the standpoint of what AI can do. And if you think that all of the influence factors from Robert Cialdini's work done in the late 80s, early 90s, social proof, scarcity, rapport, reciprocity, consistency, authority, if you don't think that those are being baked into how artificial intelligence is providing examples, you're not thinking about it right. Artificial intelligence, in the short version for me, is it's based on associations. It's using words that are often constructed together. So it's not thinking the way you and I think. It's putting words together that make sense based on what it's been reading and seeing. This is why you can get it to hallucinate sometimes, or if you do a nice job of building up the criteria and letting it look for things, then it goes down sort of a funnel and is pulling good data versus random data. My point being, in the technology war, and I'll call it, he calls it a technology war because he's talking about countries. I'll call it a technology identity shift. We're seeing a lot of solutions for artificial intelligence, solve this business problem, solve that business problem. They're not all going to work. You have to do your homework on that. We've seen people we've seen increases in resumes going out there because they can just put into artificial intelligence and, bombard the resumes out to whether it's monster.com or Indeed, whatever you're using. Then there's the trade war. So this would be a transaction shift for me. It has to do with how people earn, how people spend. I look at the gig economy. We saw Uber happening, and now, DoorDash and the whole gig economy, people making money by just putting together IKEA furniture, for example. And it's going deeper and deeper and deeper. Sometimes what I like to do when we're talking about these nebulous kind of topics is look at the extreme and see where does the extreme go. Now, I'm not saying this is where it's heading, but something came up for me. I used to be in the motorcycle rental business, the global business. So I was involved with people doing tours. So people would come from overseas. Sometimes they didn't speak the language at all, and they would ride my motorcycles across the country, and then, I'd get them back with the truck and what have you. One of the guys I worked with, a tour operator, he was out on a tour. So they're going, you think about it, you're on a 7-day tour going through the mountains, and you're on a schedule, you've got things you're going to hit, and you're going to 200 or 300 miles a day. This was all sport touring, so they weren't on the open highway, they were in the back roads. But they were sitting out in front of the hotel, and I don't know, 7 or 8 of them, they're just sitting there talking, and they're like ready to go, but there's these 2 guys who are just standing there, just hanging out, like they're not going anywhere. And he started asking, he got concerned. You guys are okay? What's going on? Oh, they haven't brought our bikes around yet. He said, what are you talking about? They haven't brought the bikes. If you don't ride a motorcycle in the U.S., you bring your own bike. Nobody brings your bike around, right? But in their country, they were so accustomed they were the haves, they were so accustomed to people waiting on them hand and foot. They just expected somebody was going to bring their bike. Now, they're fully capable of going to get their bike, but that's just what happens. And when I look at the gig economy, I'm not saying it's the early stages of that, but you see where my head is going is how does this shift happen? How does it look today? How does it look into the future? And I'm not, again, fear-mongering. I'm not saying, oh my gosh, the house is on fire. It's more about being realistic about what's happening in the near term and making adjustments real time, because it's not like these cycles are just going to, reverse and go back up. They will, but it's in a different landscape if you follow along, if you're agreeing with this approach. Then there's the capital war. This one is really interesting for me because I remember the 2008 financial crisis very well. I happened to be in a corporation that did okay through that, but I watched a lot of pain happen. And I remember this concern about breaking the buck. This is where the money that was in money market funds, this is an overnight transaction that banks make with each other. They were worried about it breaking the buck. And they closed the money market funds down, if I recall, something like 6 days. You couldn't withdraw money out of the money market for something like 5 or 6 days. Eventually, Warren Buffett stepped in and he took a big position in Goldman Sachs, and that was sort of a backstop. Now, that position was taken somewhere around probably $125. I then saw Goldman Sachs go down into the 70s or 80s before it came back up. But I bring it up because they closed down transactions in the money market because they were worried about it breaking the buck. At that time, ETFs, exchange traded funds, had about $800 billion invested in ETFs. Now, there's 2 kinds of ETFs. There's synthetic ETFs, and then there are ETFs that are backed by something. So, for example, the GLD, the gold ETF, is maybe not backed by, but it's connected to the gold, the actual gold. So they're buying enough gold, and it supports the exposure that the ETF has. The synthetic ones are using derivatives and options and different hedges as they take on more investments. The ETFs today is something like $10 trillion, up from less than $1 trillion in 2008. Why is that important to me? Because if we were worried about a liquidity spiral causing a break of the buck with money markets, what are we concerned about when it comes to ETFs? Now, again, not fear-mongering. If a liquidity spiral did what it did in 2008, and money markets, while they were not insured, they were backed by cash. They were backed by real cash that was in these different institutions. What are we talking about? And that's just ETFs. When you look at options and derivatives, there are some points of view that there's more trading back and forth in options than there are in the actual stocks. You can find data out there that says the synthetic financial market is easily 5 times the value of the actual market value. So again, this is just real. Who knows how we're going to come out of that? Who knows what's going to happen? But if we're not looking at it as the future will be different than the past, think about this. Every big thing has been a surprise, whether it's the pandemic, whether it was the 2008 financial crisis, the wars, whatever it is, every big thing was new. Every big thing was not expected. The next big thing won't be expected. What we have to be good at as organizations is not falling into fear mode, survival response. We have to be good at that Stockdale paradox, recognizing that it's difficult what we're going through, but also knowing that we'll prevail. Having that growth mindset, but it's an updated growth mindset and this ability to stay out of falling into the fixed mindset, which can happen, right? When people start thinking about that positive mental attitude, they know what's worked. It's sort of like they're in that zone, that status quo zone. They know they'll be okay. They know that having this growth mindset is going to get them back. If you've never experienced what it's like to fall through that bottom and there is no bottom, that's a different kind of change when you think about moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So we have to be able to get back to a growth mindset, no matter how steep that decline is, no matter how impactful it is. We have to have enough agency and personal leadership, which is why I bring it up a lot, to be able to get back to that growth mindset quickly. And I'm talking about in seconds and minutes, not days. We don't have days and weeks when you're being hit with it that fast. So that was the capital war that the countries have, and with individuals, it's like wealth and well-being or a recalibration of that. So, we saw with the tariffs how 401ks took an impact. I think for the most part, they probably returned back to where they were within reason, right? If a liquidity spiral occurs, we could see a much bigger change. The other thing I think about is, if you think about how the financial markets trade, the big money has to start getting out before the trend changes. They start getting out during the upswing, and that's when the less informed start buying. I talked about the collateralized debt obligations. As early as 2006, they started being sold further and further offshore. And the people in the know would look at that and say, if they're being sold further and further offshore, there's something going on, because the people who are close in, who are in the know, aren't buying them because they recognize the risk. You can almost look at that and say, should we then surmise that as ETFs get sold further and further offshore, that there's something going on? I don't know, but it has come up. And when I look at the projections for what the global ETF market will be in 2030, it makes me wonder. I look at the global market right now in ETFs is something like 14 or 15 trillion compared to the US being 10 trillion. Is that gap going to increase? If that gap starts to increase, it would make me suspect of ETFs. I'm not predicting anything. You can't predict this stuff. Like I said, we know that a system can live in signal zone, that it's going to reverse a reversal signal zone for much, much longer than we ever expect. The point is, we have to understand that VUCA is coming. We don't know where it's coming from. That's the bigger point. I'm not trying to say this is going to happen or that's going to happen, but more about, as a leader, we can't just manage as we did in the past. We need to lead, because whatever we're going to be doing in the next few years, it's going to be new and different. So we can't rely on what was there in the past. And then the next war he talks about is the geopolitical war that happens between countries. And I would say, as an individual, this has to do with the status and belonging that happens, that, where we see that in the US, we see that families are not speaking to each other anymore because of political views, because of political disagreements. We're seeing people moving away from the church, people moving towards the church. This is that, it's the equivalent, as I would say, or the similarity or the correlation to the geopolitical war. And then the last one he talks about is the military war. You see the metaphor starts to break down a little bit, or the analogy starts to break down a little bit when we talk about the countries, inter-country versus the personal. But for me, I look at it as personal surrender, which is why I talk about agency and personal leadership. That military war equivalent would be the person surrendering. It's almost like stepping into the matrix and just choosing to continue and not see the real world for it. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but again, the Stockdale paradox, we will prevail. When I started looking at how I want to do the change management, I thought I could go into more techniques or things about early adopter and all that. But what I looked at was, the bigger problem for me, or the bigger challenge for me, is that people are expecting the future to be a lot like the past. And because the past is a good predictor of the future. And we've heard this time will be different. Well, look how many big unforeseen things have happened in the past. Another way to think about it is if you have a 100-year event, let's call it a 100-year flood, that means that a flood of that magnitude has a 1% chance of happening. And that's how they get to 100 years. Well, let's say you have a 100-year fire, a 100-year flood, a 100-year tsunami, a 100-year financial crisis, a one in 100 years, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing that says all of those can't happen at once, and I'm not suggesting they are. Again, I'm walking this line of not wanting to do fear mongering, but at the same time making sure that we're aware that this time could be different, and that rather than be prepared, and I'm not talking about prepping and all that, what I'm talking about is mentally being prepared to be able to withstand whatever comes at you. That's the point. Having the presence, having the ownership of the powerful present moments that we have, 60,000 of them a day and more. Having enough presence and ownership of that so that we're making good choices and good decisions. So that's where I am. I'm going to leave it there. And again, this is also a way to generate some common language, because next week on the 20th, I'll talk about a very brief concept that's already been covered in dynamic leadership, and we'll have a discussion. Innovation, right? We're first going to innovate. Then we have to sell it. We've got to sell that innovation, and then we have to lead to scale. So that's where we'll go, and talking about real world examples, and people can kind of play off of each other's ideas and build on them, and we bring some grounded reality to this dynamic leadership conversation. All right, hopefully I'll see you next week, 8 o'clock next week.